Damon Hill grew up under a particular kind of pressure that has no clean equivalent in modern sport. His father, Graham Hill, was a two-time Formula One world champion, one of the most recognized figures in British motorsport history. For much of Damon's early career, that legacy followed him everywhere he went, and the question of whether he had earned his place in the sport on his own terms was never far from the surface. He eventually answered it. He won the 1996 Formula One World Championship at the wheel of a Williams FW18 in Japan under circumstances that left no room for argument. Now 65, Hill has spoken with increasing candor about the drivers who shaped his career most significantly. Not simply those who were fast, but those who challenged him in ways that required more than technical skill to navigate. So 5 names emerged consistently from those conversations. Each one presented a different kind of difficulty. Together, they account for most of what Damon Hill became as a racing driver. Damon Hill joined Williams as a test driver in 1991. The team's race driver that year, and through the 1992 season, was Nigel Mansell. Mansell had won the Formula One World Championship in 1992 by a margin that made the result feel inevitable from the opening round. He was the dominant personality in the Williams garage and, by extension, in British motorsport at large. His relationship with the team, with the media, and with the machinery he drove was consuming in a way that left little room for anyone else. Hill's role during this period was precisely defined. Test the car, gather data, feed the program. There was no ambiguity about the hierarchy and no expectation that it would change. What Hill did with that time was study. He worked through Mansell's lap data methodically, examined setup preferences, and built an understanding of how a driver at that level extracted performance from a Formula One car. It was a deliberate process, and it ran underneath the surface of his official responsibilities. When Mansell left Williams for IndyCar following a contract dispute at the end of 1992, Hill was promoted to a race seat. The challenge Mansell had presented was never a direct one. They never competed against each other as equals. The difficulty was more fundamental than that. Hill had to establish, while operating in Mansell's orbit, that he was a credible candidate for the seat when it became available. For a driver carrying the Hill surname into a sport his father had defined, the standard of proof required was not lenient. David Coulthard's arrival at Williams in 1994 came out of tragedy. Ayrton Senna was killed at Imola in May of that year, and Williams brought in Coulthard, their reserve driver, to partner Hill for the remainder of the season. The timing placed Hill in a difficult position. He was the team's senior driver, operating in a championship fight against Michael Schumacher that had become the defining story of the season. He needed consistent support from within the team and full clarity of purpose from his side of the garage. Coulthard, for his part, was not a straightforward figure to manage. He was fast, composed, and largely unaffected by the weight of circumstances surrounding him. While Hill was carrying the consequences of Senna's death alongside the pressures of a championship campaign, Coulthard was focused entirely on his own performance. The team's internal arrangements, including the episode in Portugal where Coulthard followed team orders to allow Hill to pass, acknowledged the hierarchy without fully resolving the friction it created. Hill has since reflected on what the Coulthard dynamic made clear to him. The most direct competition in any championship fight is not necessarily external. A teammate who shares the same car, the same engineering resources, and the same institutional support can represent a more immediate threat than any opponent across the pit lane. Hill understood this more clearly because of 1994 than he might have otherwise. The 1996 season presented a different kind of difficulty. Williams had produced the FW18, a car that was technically superior to the rest of the field by a significant margin. Hill was the team's senior driver. The conditions looked favorable. His teammate was Jacques Villeneuve. Villeneuve came to Formula One as the reigning IndyCar champion and the son of Gilles Villeneuve, a figure of considerable standing in racing history. In his very first qualifying session at the opening race in Melbourne, he set the fastest time and took pole position. It was not a promising debut in the ordinary sense. It was an immediate declaration of intent from a driver who had no interest in a transitional first year. Hill won the championship that season, clinching it in Japan. He drove precisely when it counted, but across 16 races. Villeneuve applied sustained pressure that removed any possibility of the title being decided before the final stages of the year. He won 4 Grands Prix and remained within reach of the standings throughout. At the conclusion of the season, Williams informed Hill that he would not be retained. Villeneuve was kept. Hill had delivered the championship the team had been building toward and was released regardless. The decision reflected a judgment about the future that Hill had no part in making. In 1993, Hill was promoted to a full-time race seat at Williams, alongside Ayrton Senna. By that point, Senna held 3 world championships and was widely regarded as the most complete driver the sport had produced. The working relationship was not collaborative by any meaningful definition. Senna did not share setup information freely. He operated with the understanding that within a Formula One team, information and institutional attention are finite resources, and he worked to ensure they flowed toward him. This was a deliberate approach, developed over years at the front of the grid, and Hill was on the receiving end of it from his first days as a race driver. The performance gap was evident and consistent. Senna was faster across most conditions, in qualifying, in wet weather, and through the more technically demanding corners. Hill has not offered elaborate explanations for this gap and has said as much directly. He was learning, and Senna provided a reference that was genuinely useful as a measure of what the outer limits of driving performance actually looked like. Senna died at Imola in May 1994, at the beginning of the following season. Hill was ahead of him on the road when the accident occurred. He did not witness it directly, but understood from the circumstances, the radio silence, the red flags, the faces he saw when he returned to the pits, that something serious had happened before it was confirmed. What Hill has described since is the particular disorientation of losing a reference point. The lap times he had been measuring himself against were no longer there. The standard around which he had organized his own development as a driver no longer existed. He continued through the rest of the 1994 season carrying the weight of that, and came within 1 point of the championship. The rivalry between Damon Hill and Michael Schumacher across 1994 and 1995 remains among the most closely examined in the sport's history. Its significance comes not from a single incident, but from the full span of competition it involved and the questions it left unresolved. Going into the final race of 1994, the Australian Grand Prix in Adelaide, Schumacher led Hill by 1 point in the championship standings. The margin had been determined across 16 races. On lap 35 in Adelaide, Schumacher made contact with a wall while holding the lead, damaged his Benetton, and rejoined the circuit. Hill moved to pass him at the following corner. There was contact between the two cars. Schumacher's car was eliminated immediately. Hill's suspension failed, and he was unable to continue. Schumacher took the championship by a single point. The incident has been examined at length for 30 years without reaching a settled conclusion. Hill, as asked about it repeatedly over that period, has said that he does not know with certainty what Schumacher's intentions were in that moment. That position has not changed with time, and at 65, he describes it in the same terms, with less visible agitation than in earlier years, but without any greater resolution. The contest between them extended well beyond that afternoon. Schumacher had established, by 1994, a standard of physical preparation, mechanical feedback, and race management that was ahead of the rest of the field. His capacity to maintain maximum effort over a full race distance while simultaneously managing fuel and tire performance was not yet fully understood by the teams competing against him. Hill spent 2 years measuring himself against that directly. In 1995, Schumacher won the championship again, and by a more substantial margin. Hill has said that the experience of that period led him to question, at certain points, whether he was capable of competing at the level that was being demanded of him. The answer came the following year. He won the 1996 championship in Japan at a circuit where the title had eluded him in previous seasons, and did so with enough authority that the result could not be read as circumstantial. Across a professional career defined by proximity to exceptional talent and adverse circumstances, 5 drivers shaped Damon Hill's development most directly. Mansell established the terms of entry. Hill had to demonstrate, working within a team that had no particular obligation to regard him as a future champion, that he warranted a race seat when one became available. Coulthard clarified a competitive reality that applies across elite sport. The most immediate challenge to a driver's position does not always come from outside the team. Villeneuve prevented any comfortable margin in the year Hill won the championship, then, indirectly, contributed to the decision to end Hill's tenure at Williams despite the title he had just delivered. Senna provided a measure of performance that Hill has described as simultaneously instructive and daunting, and whose absence after Imola in 1994 created a specific kind of difficulty that is hard to characterize in conventional terms. And Schumacher, across 2 seasons of direct competition, 1 unresolved incident, saw in a period that Hill has described as the most psychologically demanding of his career, represented the primary test of whether Hill belonged at the front of the sport at all. At 65, Hill speaks about each of these figures without apparent bitterness. His reflections are measured, and the conclusions he draws are not generous with certainty. What he does say clearly is that the career he built, the championship he won, the credibility he established, ran directly through each of those encounters. The 1996 World Championship belongs to Damon Hill. He earned it in full.